Let's take a quick look at the narrative, that is, the story that's been told as we've gone through and as we're getting ready for the second test. So we started out with limits. There were the formal limits and there were the informal limits. The informal limits with the words arbitrary and sufficient, the ones we used are not sufficient to prove the limit laws. So we'll have to assume, or we had to assume, that the limit laws and rules just held and somebody else had proven those. After limits, we started chapter 3, which had to do with the definition of the derivative and then deriving all of the differentiation laws. So with the definition of the derivative and the limit laws that we have on hand and a little algebra, trigonometry, and geometry that we presumably have on hand, we were able to derive a fair number of differentiation laws using the definition of the derivative and limits. A somewhat tedious process. After that, after we have this set of basic differentiation laws, we can abandon the definition route and we can just take these differentiation laws and the algebra, geometry, and trig that we know, and we can come up with additional derivatives without having to go back to the definition. So that's a relief. And then finally, we are going to be able to obtain the inverse derivatives of all these functions that we now know how to differentiate. And the way we do that is we take implicit differentiation and the definition of the inverse function from pre-calculus, and we can combine those to come up with the derivatives of the inverse functions for those functions that we know how to differentiate. And then finally, as a grand finale, we're going to define the hyperbolic trig functions, which are very similar to the regular trig functions but are very important in STEM disciplines. And we'll define some hyperbolic trig identities, which are very similar to the trig identities. We'll find the derivatives of the hyperbolic trig functions. Then we'll apply our implicit differentiation and inverse function definition routine to come up with the derivatives of the inverse hyperbolic trig functions. And after that, we will essentially be able to differentiate any function that you can create out of the basic elementary functions that you've learned up to this point in mathematics. And that's a pretty powerful thing to be able to do, to write any function, no matter how complicated, using these functions that you see here on this page. And for sure, you can differentiate it. You may not want to do it by hand, but they can be differentiated.